Neil is administrator of the Maryland State Highway Administration. He's been there since January, in that position, January 2003. For that agency, he maintains and operates nearly 17,000 lane miles of roadway, 2,500 bridges, employs more than 3,200 professionals in a variety of disciplines, and an annual budget of $1.7 billion. He's a registered professional engineer, and he served in various capacities in that agency. And I don't know what Neil will say, but about 2.5 decades or so, quite a while, he's been there. He's an active member of various committees and is a native of Massachusetts. He holds 2 undergraduate degrees, and you can read about him in the profile. You want to read more about Neil. Neil, you come, please.
Thank you, John, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here this morning. I was struck, I walked in just as Laurie was starting to talk about going back to 1962 and the history of the environmental movement, and those in the environmental community becoming very good at learning how to say no. And we had a lot of that experience in Maryland, and we were not accomplishing a lot of things from a transportation mobility standpoint or from an environmental standpoint. And we recognized that we needed to change the dynamic of the relationship between the Department of Transportation, and particularly State Highway Administration, environmental regulators, and environmental advocates, and figure out a way that we could be creating a win-win solution. And I am convinced, and we'll talk some more about some of the approaches that we're taking on this, but that ultimately is the key if we're going to be able to achieve common objectives, objectives of both mobility and improvement to the environment, not just protection to the environment itself. And I think we're really on the cusp right now within the transportation community, as well as within the environmental community, of starting to understand, if we do look at this from a win-win perspective, how we truly can be making significant strides and improvements for the environment. And that's really the underlying theme and background in terms of what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to start with just the green infrastructure approach as it relates to transportation. I know most of you in this room are not transportation professionals, so I need to give you a little bit of context on that. What Maryland is doing from a green infrastructure assessment standpoint, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we're using in Maryland, specifically talking about US 301 case study. This is a highway project that we worked together with Chris and her colleagues at the Conservation Fund in taking a green infrastructure approach. And then I want to talk about a few tools that are under development at both the national and state level. And I'm going to go very, very quickly, just scratching the surface. So if you have questions, we certainly can be discussing them later. Recognizing that many of you do not have a transportation background, the key point that I want to be making with this slide is we really look at transportation from several different levels. We look at it from a systems perspective, a metropolitan area-wide perspective, a statewide perspective. Many of you who do get involved in transportation tend to get involved more at a project level. And we recognize that we have to be making decisions in transportation from the broadest regional perspective, from a quarter level, from an individual project perspective, and that we have to be thinking in terms of our intersection with the environment and how we not just impact the environment, but ultimately how we can be working together in trying to achieve environmental objectives at that regional or metropolitan level, at the quarter level, and at the project level. This is an evolution slide. Talks about going back to, now I didn't go back to 1962, I went back to 1970, and the National Environmental Policy Act here, but at the beginning, when we started to try to apply NEPA, transportation and environmental agencies in particular, we're having a hard time trying to figure out how do we work through and develop a process where we can figure out how transportation projects can go forward, environmental protection can be taking place, and there wasn't much of an intersection or interaction between the agencies in what I would call a positive collaborative manner. As individual pieces of legislation passed, we tended to get into individual resource areas, focus on individual resource areas. The transportation agencies recognized that they did have environmental compliance responsibilities, but under the laws and regulations, but took purely a compliance standpoint, what was the minimum that we could do to be able to get the approvals that we needed. And it really has only been within the last 10 years or so that I would say within the transportation community that we have started to recognize that we have a much broader environmental stewardship responsibility, that we need to be thinking about environmental systems, how we interact with environmental systems, as opposed to just localized impacts that we need to be trying to figure out how to mitigate, how we can be working more effectively together in partnership with environmental resource agencies and environmental advocacy groups in figuring out how we can be, as transportation agencies, helping to achieve environmental objectives as well. And finally now, in looking from a systems perspective at transportation and environmental systems together, looking at common objectives that we have, ways that we together can be trying to achieve the objectives that we want to from a sustainability standpoint, and taking a much longer term perspective and taking a much broader perspective from a system perspective as well. This will give you, and you'll be able to get this presentation after the conference is over, but it will give you some of the key milestones in terms of both statutes, regulations, executive orders, along that evolution that we've had over the last 40 years or so. So if I compare the way things used to be done with the way that we're evolving right now, transportation agencies used to focus on what is the transportation solution that we want to be proposing. We would then go in and look at what the impacts are associated with various alternatives, figure out ways to mitigate those impacts, usually at a very local level. And we would get reaction, whether it was from the community, from environmental resource agencies, from environmental groups. And it was very much a reaction mode, and often the reaction was not very positive at all. Now we recognize that we need to be looking from a much broader perspective, from a community perspective, from an environmental systems perspective, and a transportation perspective, and look at how we can be trying to integrate common goals and be developing solutions that are addressing goals across that full range as well. We recognize that we need to be working with stakeholders throughout the entire process and not be in a reaction mode, but have the stakeholders actually involved with us as we try to define what the transportation alternatives are that we're going to be trying to develop to solve problems, have the stakeholders involved in the definition of what the problem is that's being solved itself, and looking at what our common goals are that we can be trying to achieve from a community and environmental perspective as well. Now, from a green infrastructure standpoint, how can looking at things from a green infrastructure perspective help us in terms of this new way of addressing transportation? In particular, what tools can we be taking advantage of so that we can truly be looking at environmental systems and what we can be doing to be maximizing the benefits that we are spending our money on to try to help the environment. Transportation spends a lot of money on environmental mitigation. And one of the things that I was becoming very frustrated with as the head of a transportation agency was, are we really maximizing the value, the environmental value that we're getting for all of the money that's being spent on environment. And recognize that we really needed to be taking a different approach and not just looking at very localized impacts and localized mitigation for those impacts, but recognizing that almost every environmental resource that we were in some way impacting was part of a larger system. There were needs, significant needs in many cases, for those environmental resources, and there are ways that we could be doing much greater benefit for the environment if we were looking at what the needs were from a systems perspective as opposed to that very local perspective as well. But to be able to do that, we had to have the information to understand the environmental systems, to be understanding the significance of those environmental systems, and to be understanding where the needs and the gaps were in those environmental systems as well. So we have been working very closely with both our federal and state environmental resource partners, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail, in terms of ensuring that we have the information available and enables us to take that systems perspective, and working with them throughout the development of our alternatives in thinking about the environmental systems that we are interacting with. So recognizing that, I think Chris said there are 36 states represented here, 3 foreign countries. Not all of you are familiar with Maryland. Maryland is a fairly small state, but a very populous state. 90% of our population lives within urban areas. We have one of the environmental treasures of the United States that is largely located within Maryland in the Chesapeake Bay. It actually has enabled us, I think, to be doing a lot more than some other states in terms of having the support from our citizens because they have such a strong environmental ethic because of the significance of the Chesapeake Bay and recognition of the Chesapeake Bay and the challenges that we have associated with the Chesapeake Bay from an environmental perspective. So we have had pretty broad support in terms of really reaching out and going much further than many other states, state DOTs have in terms of some of the kinds of environmental approaches that we have taken. We've recognized in Maryland that one of our most significant challenges that we have, particularly as related to the Chesapeake Bay, is the fragmentation of many of our environmental systems, and that we need to be better understanding what that fragmentation is, what the challenges are, and how we can be trying to both address the trends as well as try to undo some of the impacts that we've had as well. So from a green infrastructure assessment standpoint, we worked very closely with our Environmental Resource Agency partners in terms of developing a GIS system that we use as well as they use in terms of both identifying and prioritizing resources and looking at them from a conservation standpoint, from a restoration standpoint, and also as we interact with development activity that is taking place and trying to do better planning for land use development, not just transportation planning itself and its interaction with the environmental resources that we're trying to protect. We have developed a green infrastructure network on a statewide basis. This is a map that shows some of the resources from a statewide perspective. We'll drill down a little bit in terms of a specific case study in a second. But you can see we've highlighted what is protected as well as what is unprotected. And we've recognized that the unprotected areas, especially where we have threats associated with them, is where together we need to be concentrating a lot of our resources in terms of protection from an environmental perspective. We've taken a hubs and quarters approach in terms of recognizing that we not just have significant resources at a hub or a specific location, but also quarters from an environmental perspective that connect those hubs as well. We've particularly focused on where do we have some challenges, where do we have some gaps from an environmental resource perspective that we need to be concentrating where our money gets spent in terms of trying to protect those particular gaps, as well as where we've had degradation and some of the restoration money that we can be putting in from a mitigation standpoint can give us the greatest benefit from, for example, a stream valley perspective as opposed to just trying to mitigate at the particular local level. Okay, now we worked in partnership with the Conservation Fund in taking this approach and applying it specifically to a project that we had along the US 301 corridor in southern Maryland, just southeast of Washington, D.C. You can see here, this is that star that was just south of Washington, D.C. represents the area that we're talking about. US 301 is the main roadway that goes through the center of this area. We have mapped the environmental resources, working together with environmental resource agencies throughout the corridor. And then that has guided us a great deal, both in terms of trying to look at various transportation corridors within the larger area itself, as well and guiding us in terms of the alignments of those corridors, what needs to be protected, as well as providing us with information on where some of the threats are that we need to be trying to protect within that area. Working together with the Conservation Fund again, we were trying to prioritize both the activities that we had, conservation versus restoration versus management, and the natural resources. You can see the full range of natural resources, the relative priorities of those resources from a protection standpoint within the corridor itself. And you'll be hearing a lot more about details of this later in the conference. I'm just going through from more of a strategic perspective right now so that you start to get the sense of how we're using some of these tools and approaches. Traditionally, we had gone through and identified mitigation opportunities together with resource agencies, and we rank-based those projects, and it was on a project level. From a resource protection standpoint, from a resource opportunity perspective, as opposed to really looking at this environmental value perspective and trying to figure out where do we get the greatest return on our investment from an environmental value perspective. And by trying to optimize the investment in the dollars that we're making in terms of environmental protection, we've actually ended up determining that we're able to do more from an overall perspective in terms of benefits from an environmental perspective than the traditional rank-based approach that we've been taking. Okay, now, at a national level, there's national level research under the sponsorship of the National Academies of Sciences Transportation Research Board that is taking this approach and trying to develop national tools to be guiding both transportation agencies as well as environmental resource agencies at looking at the more holistic environmental systems, protection perspective, as well as opportunities perspective. So the kinds of tools that we've just talked about for the US 301 corridor are being developed under the auspices of the Transportation Research Board as part of research funding that's been made available by Congress as well. There are two projects that are being sponsored under this Strategic Highway Research Program research that is underway right now. The first of these is development of regional ecosystems framework and processes and making the case from a business perspective in terms of why this type of approach should be taken by state departments of transportation and resource agencies as well, and how it is connected into the NEPA process, the 404 permitting process, and the Section 7 process as well. The second part of this research is really developing tools that enable us to better quantify what the credits are that transportation agencies should be receiving for the type of mitigation and restoration and protection investments that they're making as well. So I'm expecting that we will have outcomes from that research coming out within the next several months, and I would commend all of you to be really looking at the outcome of that particular research. Within Maryland, we're working together with the EPA Region 3 office and our Department of Natural Resources in terms of developing a watershed resources registry. We've done a lot of mapping, as you can see before, in terms of the resources themselves, what the significance of the resources are. The approach that's being taken here is to be looking at the opportunities that we have in terms of either protection or restoration or enhancement to those resources, and developing a registry or an inventory of the types of projects that, whether it's developers or transportation agencies or local governments, will have available to them, what kinds of projects the resource agencies end up saying are high priorities in terms of protection of the resources that we all are trying to protect. And this particularly, by spending the money and the time in developing that, it actually ends up saving agencies like ours in terms of having that information available to us as well, so it can be very cost effective to us. Within Maryland itself, as well as within the 6 states of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, EPA is working with each of the states right now and developing total maximum daily loads for the Chesapeake Bay itself. We have water improvement plans that have been developed that have tremendous burden that is placed on governmental agencies at both the state and local level in terms of water quality improvements that are going to be necessary. And that water resources registry is going to be an extremely valuable tool to us as we again look at what are the opportunities that give us the greatest return on investment for the money that we're spending on trying to make water quality improvements for the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so why use these tools? I guess my response to that is I don't think we can afford not to. Again, with scarce resources that are available, the expectation of agencies such as mine is that we're going to be wise stewards of the dollars that we are investing, that we get greatest value for the dollars that we are spending, regardless of whether it is dollars that are being spent on the environment or whether it's on transportation improvement or traffic operations or whatever. And the green infrastructure tools that are available to us, taking the broader green infrastructure approach, I am convinced will end up giving us that greatest value, environmental value for the dollars that we have spent and invested. And thank you very much.